tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
That is one thing that I am happy to always talk about on the show, the national sovereignty discussion, because it's one that is never spoken about. No countries have ever existed for long when they don't protect their own security and their own sovereignty. And we have increasingly countries that are willing to abdicate that and individuals that don't seem to care about it. But I want to return to that aspect we were talking about with corporate Canada and corporate Canada abdicating its responsibility. One of the things you also see is the immersion of these companies in the DEI world. And this is something that we see even more than in corporate Canada in academic settings. Academic institutions have dropped even the pretense that they hire based on merit, with more positions that are earmarked, not even just preferential hiring for DEI applicants, but positions that are only available to applicants that check off some box of being a member of some so-called marginalized group. Now, interestingly enough, when we're talking about candidates, say, with PhDs, we're not talking about people who have been truly marginalized in their lives. We're talking about the academic elites, regardless of whether you're trans or cis or black or white or anything. Now, it was quite interesting. There was a piece in Nature, which used to be an esteemed journal published in the United States, a piece in Nature that was celebrating the rise of diversity hiring, which comes obviously at the expense of merit-based hiring. Why can we not just return to the basics, return to allowing merit to govern who we're hiring, especially when, as was noted in a column in the National Post by Professor Lawrence Krauss, there wasn't really any defense of why these things are working or if they were. Professor Krauss joins us now. It's good to talk to you, Professor. Thanks for coming on today.
It's good to be back with you. It was nice to see Bruce Party on earlier. He's actually, I'm editing a book and he's got a chapter in it, so it's nice to.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I look forward to seeing that when it comes out here. This is, Science Magazine has, of course, published some of the most, rigorously vetted, peer-reviewed scientific research in the past. And now there's not even a pretense of scientific basis for this. Explain what they're passing off here as justification for DEI over merit.
Yeah. First, we should correct. You earlier said Nature.
Sorry, science.
But it's all right. Nature's done equally bad. We could have
fair enough.
about Nature and the ridiculous editorials that have appeared there. Both Nature and Science, which are two of the preeminent science journals in the world, or have been, and I have to say I published in both. They're both coming out in not talking about science, and in particular, you'd think a science journal when they talked about whether some action took place, what they first talk about what the empirical evidence would be to support the action and what the consequences of the action are. But they didn't do any of those things. It was just a remarkable statement that suddenly, and it was like celebrating this remarkable fact that this university in Denmark had announced a policy where for the first 6 months of every year, they would only hire women. And they announced that, guess what? The number of women increased. Isn't that amazing? And it's like, and again, what's also equally amazing, there was no discussion in the article about merit or about qualifications, except to say two things: that many of the women who were headhunted, they went out and sought women. This is an engineering school. Let's make that clear. So it has a low proportion of women. One of the reasons was that women don't seem to want to go into engineering, but that is never, ever discussed in this kind of article. The assumption is that somehow they're being kept out. So the school went out and headhunted women, and the only statement that was made, which kind of almost humorous, was that a number of the women who were headhunted said they were amazed to be headhunted because they didn't think they were qualified for the jobs. and then the president of the university said, you know what, women are just like that. And so we have to take that into account. And you know what? Women are less likely to apply for a job if they don't have all the qualifications. But so we're really happy that they're coming in. And when you read that, you think, okay, so we really want to take people who don't have qualifications for the job. And that's a good thing. And it also is sexist because it's assuming that, there aren't men in the world who say, well, maybe I really aren't qualified for this, or I shouldn't do this. But ultimately, the final question, which is, what were the qualifications? What were was the bar lowered for these people? And how pervasive this is in academia was really put home for me with a colleague of mine who's a professor at USC in California, pointed out that a colleague of hers who's Dutch said to her, well, there's no discrimination here, because we're not keeping men out, we're just creating positions for women, and it's like that you could say that without realizing what you're saying, and be an academic in an institution is kind of remarkable.
Let's assume for a moment that male and female engineers are both equally good, that there's no distinction between the two. So in any group of 100 male engineers and 100 female engineers, let's say that there are the same number that are qualified and the same number that are unqualified. But let's now say that there are 10% of the engineers who are women and 90% are men, which is not actually that far off. So if you're hiring 50% of the positions being women, that means you're necessarily elevating people who are unqualified. And they're not unqualified because they're women. They're unqualified because you're manipulating your talent pool in a way that you wouldn't if you were just hiring the aptitudes. I mean, this is not, I'm not an eminent physicist like yourself. I'm not a scientist. I get foggy with numbers, but I don't think I'm missing anything here. But these people who are a lot more educated than I am seem to be.
Well, you're taking the numbers as indeed correct in general. I mean, there can always be exceptions, but it is a problem when, and actually this has happened in Canada in a number of cases, both in the number of people in the cabinet of the current prime minister, but also in what the Canadian government is doing regarding the most prestigious chairs in academia, the Canada Research Council, Canada Research
Chairs, yes.
Yeah, and they're requiring that to match the demographics of the background society exactly, and therefore requiring, among other things, that only women can be offered these positions. And the real question is, and in order to do the statistics properly for what you said, your presumption is perfectly reasonable a priori if you don't know any of the numbers. It's more reasonable to assume what you assumed than to assume the opposite. But better still is to look at the pool of applicants, the pool of people who are applying. If 90% of the people who are applying for positions are male, and you take 50% of the positions and give them to females, say, then clearly you're doing something wrong. I mean, if there's equal application, if there are equal pools, that's one thing. But you have to look at the pools of the applicants. And there's lots of studies that suggest, and every time people have tried to enforce these demographic rules in, say, engineering, that they find that generally they attract fewer women, even if you try and do these things. There are other fields, like, by the way, education, which are 80 or 90% women at universities and in colleges, but no one tries to turn it around the other way. So the point is that there are predilections, and in fact, there have been studies of, there's some societies you might say that are more egalitarian, like ones in Scandinavia. And interestingly enough, those which seem to have fewer barriers for women doing things have even a larger gap between in certain STEM fields like engineering than in the West. So there are many reasons why people may not choose to go into a field, and to say that to assume it's always sexism or racism is clearly to make an assumption that you have an obligation to show, first of all. But secondly, you're ultimately doing a disservice to everyone because you're also suggesting that you're being patronizing to women. You're suggesting that they can't compete, first of all, in an open playing field, and it's also arguing that there are only certain fields that you want to put women in, and there are other fields you don't care that there are no men in. The whole thing is patronizing women, discriminating against men, and anti-merit. On the surface, it makes no sense. Now, I'm a scientist, and I'm perfectly happy to be proved wrong by data and evidence, but there's no such data and evidence applied here, or in fact, every bit of evidence I've ever seen suggests the opposite. That first of all, these kind of brute force affirmative action techniques don't work in general to affect the field. Mm-hmm. They also stigmatize the people who do get the jobs, because if they get a job because it's a women-only job, then your presumption is that's why they got the job, not because of their qualifications. And the last thing is, you're generally not doing all these things are well motivated to try and increase the opportunities for people. But especially people who are really marginalized. But what you're doing when you're hiring faculty is you're not dealing with people who are marginalized. You're dealing with the elites generally. You're dealing with people who've gone to get a PhD at a reasonable university. And so you're not digging into the people who are really, I used to live in Cleveland, the kids in the public schools there who don't have textbooks because the schools are run down. And those are the people you want to try and give a leg up to. You want to provide opportunities. But at the highest end of academia, you're generally not.
Oh, yeah.
What diversity is all about.
The idea that a Harvard-educated black woman is more marginalized than a white working class guy from rural Ohio or something is just not at all.
It's discriminatory, and it's exactly the right. I mean, so it's doing none of the things that these are all well motivated in principle, but it's not doing what you want, and then it's ill brought about, and the net consequence hurt, as far as I can see, generally hurts everyone. The people who get the jobs are stigmatized. People who don't get the jobs, the men who don't get the jobs are hurt. If you're hiring people who aren't qualified or as qualified, you're finding your merit is going down. So what's the upside except for virtue signaling? That's what this is all about.
Do the proponents of this, in your experience, argue that diversity is just in and of itself the goal? Diversity is an established as a first principle positive, and therefore a more diverse faculty is better? Or do they argue that diversity inherently increases something else, that it makes for a better education or a better faculty?
The claim is that diversity improves quality. Now, look, I can understand. Look, the statement is always made that if you're let's say a woman and all your professors are male, maybe you don't feel as attached to the field, and it's nice to have a role model. Mm-hmm. I understand all of that argument. But
it's a bit more esoteric, but there's a logic to it. Yes.
Yeah. But the notion that diversity somehow improves the field is, as far as I can see, without evidence. And the whole point is that it's what we really want is equality of opportunity. It's not equality of outcomes. And I'm all in favor. And my politics I'm sure are to the left of yours or have been. But I really do think that we really need to work to try and ensure, a poor working class single mother or a single father has opportunities, and they got bigger challenges. But and so we want to try and provide equality of opportunity, but that's different than equality of outcome, and that's what this kind of ridiculous policy is all about. And again, in academia, which is the last possible place, the faculty, if you're hiring faculty at university, you've already taken a very select hand-picked subset of the population who've gone to get a degree, gone to get a PhD, many of them at first-rate colleges. They're, if you like, I hate to use the word, but they're already privileged in that sense. And so I don't like anything that's sacred that you can't question. And the claim that diversity improves quality, and diversity meaning diversity of identity. If we label these people and give them identities, either being female or trans or indigenous or black or whatever, if you label them by that somehow having enough labels makes it better, it's demeaning, I think, to people. And you need to see data, and that's what it's all about. I think it's
and I mean, I used to, years ago when I had this conversation with someone, I said, well, if you're going in for surgery, do you want the most diverse operating room or do you want the best? Now I would hesitate to even ask that question because I'm terrified of what some people would answer.
Yeah, and that's the real problem, which is one of the reasons actually I'm editing this book specifically at universities, is that I'm well known as someone who's not particularly religious. And quite the opposite. And one of the things that I don't like about sacredness is that you can't ask questions, that nothing is sacred. Everything should be subject to question, especially in science. And what's scary is you can't ask the question, even the question, is a more diverse operating room better for patients? I mean, maybe it is, but you can't even ask the question or raise a doubt without expecting to be ostracized or sometimes removed. And that's scary, because not only are these policies taking place, but if faculty oppose these policies, then they're subject to real problems at universities. So I suspect at many of these universities, faculty roll their eyes and say, look, we just want to get on what we're doing. We want to stay below the radar. And if we speak out, it's going to end up causing us grief. And I want to just do my own thing. And I just, let them do what they want. And that's fine. And unfortunately, that's the way it is. Professor for 40 years, and that's generally the faculty's attitude about almost anything.
Yeah, just get by. Professor Lawrence Krauss, president of the Origins Project Foundation, also host of the Origins podcast. Thank you so much for coming on, Professor. Good to talk to you.
It's been a pleasure. You take care.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.